Well, welcome everybody. Excited to have everyone. Glad that you joined. What we're going to be talking about today is the rise of artificial intelligence, and specifically, right, the rise of AI, and from a cybersecurity lens. There's going to be a couple of different approaches we take to that, but the topic is protecting your business in the age of AI. Um, just a reference. We will answer questions at the end. So if you have any questions, please pop them into the Q&A chat, and then we'll get to those at the end. Just by way of introductions, my name is Vin Curran. I'm the head of revenue for Acrisure Cyber Services, and I'll act as the moderator for this discussion. But I'm joined by two awesome colleagues. I'll let them introduce themselves. I guess we'll start with you, Enrique, and then we can go to Max after that.
Sure. And thank you, Vin. Excited to be on here and get a chance to just kind of talk shop with some folks. Enrique Malacara, Director of InfoSec here at Acrisure Cyber Services. Been with Acrisure for about 3 years, and in the tech field, better part of nearly 2 decades at this point, decade and a half. Early career-wise and education, really focused on technology. Started pursuing a degree in programming, and ended up shifting with a bit more of a business focus, undergrad in MIS and business management. So, but even with that, always been on the technical side of the house. Go all the way back to field tech, systems engineer, lead engineering, working for both managed service providers as well as private organizations, and kind of found that I liked the pace of consulting, and I liked the gratification of helping the businesses, helping the people at those businesses, and seeing the results of our work. So, these days I am overseeing the commercial security offering of Acrisure Cyber Services, which is our managed detection response, management of security controls, and really just trying to drive innovation across our operations, and identify new services, new opportunities to provide additional value, and just continue to improve upon ourselves. So,
Thanks, Enrique. Thanks, Van. Thank you, everybody, for giving me the opportunity to present today, and I very much appreciate it. I'm relatively new to the Acrisure world. My name is Max Bobbies. I run Cyber Risk Advisory. We're building it from scratch inside the organization, but that doesn't necessarily imply that I'm myself building it from scratch for me. No, I've been involved in Homeland Security, defense, and intelligence markets for about 25 years now. Short hiatus for about 3 years doing major federal programs for Fortune 100 company, and prior to joining one of the company that was acquired by Acrisure, I was mainly involved in consulting and risk advisory as part of M&A due diligence. And that resulted in a spin out where we basically informed catastrophic cyber policies in the commercial markets. From there, I went into the maritime industry writ large, maritime supply chain globally. So shipping, ports, terminal operators, trucking companies, pretty much that whole transportation spectrum, including energy. So I'm excited about joining the Acrisure team. I come from a small group where we do mainly high-end risk advisory services, and I'm looking forward to building out the capabilities with Enrique and Vin and the rest of the ACS team.
Well, excited to have you both here. I guess first and foremost, right, for us and for everyone to get the most out of this conversation, we want to frame it up or provide the lens that we're going to frame this conversation up with. So we're going to look at it through 3 lenses, right? We have tech, so that could be tools, products, all that fun stuff. Processes, so that could be internal processes, ones that your organization is following, and ones you might not even be aware of. And then lastly, right, end users, people, right? Ultimately, it's employees that are behind keyboards. It's employees that are doing things, and then on the flip side, it's typically people that are on the in the threat actor space. So first and foremost, I want to ask Max and Enrique, and I guess Enrique, maybe we could start with you, right? With your background being engineering, what is AI, right? We hear like there's a ton of hype. We're definitely in this big hype cycle of There's a little bit of fear mongering, or actually a lot of fear mongering, right? A lot of folks think that it could be the end of employment as we know it. But then there are a lot of folks that are saying it's going to be a huge tool and a huge competitive advantage for organizations and for people. So I guess from your standpoint, what is AI?
Yeah, yeah, definitely a great place to start, right? I think, when a lot of people tend to think of AI, they think of autonomous beings, right? Going to, your mind kind of flips to the Turing tests and having, that human-like intelligence. And, the truth of the matter is we're certainly not there yet. Um, but AI is a bit of a broad term, right? We've got a lot of different techniques behind what AI truly is, right? You've got machine learning and training algorithms on large data sets. You've got natural language processing and the things that a lot of folks have come to start to utilize, like your Chat GPTs, your Gemini agents, that type of thing, or even like computer vision, right, where we take a graphic as an input or some type of visual input, right, and are able uh, to make decisions off of that or inference off of that. And you see a lot of that in medical practice, right, with imaging, radiology, that type of stuff. But I think when most people think of the term AI, what they're really thinking of are those machine learning algorithms, right, and the application of those, which is really like a data driven training tool, right, for your computers, if we want to think of it that way. But it's usually that and the language modeling, um, which boils down to really just kind of like a fancy autocomplete, right? But that's what you see, the Chat GPTs and again Gemini and whatnot. That's really what we're getting at there. So, um, as far as the hype cycle, I think you see it with any real disruptive technology, right? Going back to the early, uprise or coming up of computing in general, right? The dot-com era and kind of the World Wide Web and everybody jumping on that bandwagon. And I think to a certain extent, there certainly is a lot and a lot of hype. You go to any tech conference, any vendor conference, and everybody's got AI somewhere on their marketing materials. But the truth is we're still in an early adopter phase, and I think maybe 5-10% of those vendors in that hall are truly utilizing artificial intelligence in a real way. Um,
AI does seem to have, or seem to be a double-edged sword, right, in the impact on business. And so I think it would be really interesting, particularly where you're at, right? You're the head of a security operations center that runs 24/7 and is constantly dealing with threat actors. So I think starting from the attack phase, what are we seeing, or what are you seeing across the board, right, from AI being leveraged by threat actors, or how is it being leveraged, if it is? That's an assumption, but I would love for you to opine.
yeah. Firstly, I don't know if I'd agree on the double-edged sword, euphemism there. It's in my mind, it's no different than any other technology that we bring into a business, right? In the sense of there's capabilities that are introduced by it, there's risks that are introduced by it, there's a level of understanding that we as a business should have of that tool, of that technology, right? So that we can make informed decisions on where it fits in our operations as it relates to just how is it changing. I'm interpreting that as how is it changing the way that we secure business operations, and how are threat actors leveraging it. We're really already seeing it. We're already there. From a threat actor perspective, right? The barrier to entry to target an organization is greatly reduced. The number one claim, I like to put things through the lens of like cyber liability insurance, just given our organization. But the number one driver for claims is by and large business email compromise, right? That's typically things like direct deposit impersonation, wire fraud or malicious funds transfers, and that generally starts with that human element, right? Getting somebody inside the business to trust you. Yeah, we've got the traditional tools to protect against that, but now as a threat actor, I can have a free Chat GPT account. I can paste in all the publicly available info from your organization, right? Your LinkedIn profiles, your social media, profiles, and just ask it, like, who in this organization would be most likely to be responsible for funds transfers and accounts payable? Okay, now that I know that, right? If we're able to correlate, right, some of your vendors and your partners, and maybe some of that's from a marketing campaign, maybe they did a testimonial for you, right? But now I can toss it in there and say, okay, assume this third party is a vendor and we have a contract or we're doing business. Create an email chain that is walking through an accounts payable from an overdue accounts receivable. Make it urgent. Make sure you're using people's names and make it seem a little informal because we've known each other for a while. And as that threat actor, I can copy and paste that into an email chain. As long as I can get it to your staff member, it's becoming very hard to tell the difference between not just what is malicious and what's not, but how much of this is actually fabricated, right? If we're able to get that meticulous on the nuance and the specifics around those organizations. So business email compromise, I think, is going to be continue to be a huge issue. Um, there's also the fact that when we talk about things like um, you know password spraying, brute force attempts, and traditional malware and that type of thing, a lot of that was already automated, right? But now think about it in that not only are we automating it, but we can potentially make that context aware, right? We've I forget the name of the group that did it, but there was a proof of concept about having a malware payload that had a small AI agent embedded in it. And within months, that was out there in the wild, right? And it's becoming the type of thing where you have a malicious package that is metamorphic or harder to detect because it can generate code on the fly, right? You can give it a prompt to say, look at the services running on this machine and structure your payload or your communications back to me in a way that blends in, right? And it's becoming that much more difficult to stop or see. And yeah, it's kind of changing across the board on the threat actor side.
I want to talk about one more threat, and that's the issue of data poisoning. And so when you think about traditional cybersecurity, right, the goal is often binary, right? You know, we want to deny, we want to detect intrusions, we want to restore functions, recover, and remediate, right? But AI doesn't necessarily work that way. AI threats actually distort data, right? They're not about shutting things down. They're not about creating a wiper attack or, they can support all those things at scale, but poisoned data can actually reshape how an organization's ERP systems can function. For example, if you think of accounting, finance, imagine if an AI generated attack against your Oracle financials resulted in some data manipulation inside transaction data. Or maybe on the medical side, we're talking about interpretation of medical scans or other content without alerts. So cyber's always been about defending systems, but in an AI environment, systems are not static. The paradigm actually shifts. It moves from perimeter defense to really something that's more about inference defense. Adversaries are not really breaching networks. I mean, they are, but they're not limiting them. When AI is employed, an adversary's use of the data poisoning, they're tampering with knowledge itself. And I think that is so potentially insidious. This has been talked about in the national security strategies that have been published by the government year over year. And data integrity has been a big front and center in those areas or those areas of thinking for years, and AI goes right against that. So I just want to add that a little extra color to what Enrique was saying.
We've been covering a lot of the negative, and it's ironic that this weekend the Post released an article saying that AI ushers in the golden age of hacking. as three folks who have been in this for a handful of years, we feel like we've been in the golden age. So it's kind of alarming that they're saying that we're just getting there. I do want to talk a little bit about how orgs are leveraging AI to potentially protect themselves. If Enrique, if you wanted to jump there, I would be curious to hear if, we've talked about the negatives, are there positives?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, right? If anything, I think uh, the use of AI by threat actors, right, helps to drive and put a spur in the side of defenders. And there's certainly real world applications that we've seen of that, right? Anything from um, email security, right? Going back to the business email compromise, or you fight fire with fire, right? Effective email security now is going to have to employ those same machine learning and language modeling techniques to build, just like Max was saying, identity profiles around your individuals, the staff in your organization, to figure out when they're communicating with vendors, what's expected, what's normal, is that really them? Um, the business email compromise piece, majority of the time comes from a vendor and you engage with. Their organization gets an account that gets compromised. Maybe it's phishing or some other, endpoint compromise, but they then try and, laterally move to your organization via that phishing email or something as innocuous as a plain text email. And the industry disruptors that are addressing that exact problem are using, the tools, the AI tools that we're talking about here. So that's the first piece of it, and it has proven effective. I think, as it relates to software development, certainly we've seen application of AI in that context, right? In that you can have you can have tooling that is going to dynamically evaluate your code repositories. It's going to evaluate and monitor, right, code execution, pushes to your production environment to see, is that in line, is that abnormal? And it all comes back to the data inputs, right? And training on what is normal. Maybe that 3 a.m. push to production for that new software version is not actually something that we would expect, right? And I think in just even recent weeks with supply chain compromise, right? For things like the NPM packages that we just saw happen, and for those that aren't aware, that's a Linux operating system, and NPM releases more or less modules or components that those operating systems and different tooling on there relies on, and they were compromised, right? The people that are maintaining the core to some of these systems ended up pushing out packages with malicious, I believe it was cryptocurrency miners, is what it ended up being to start, right? But figuring out when those abnormalities are taking place and getting pushed across the supply chain.
Max, you touched on this a little bit, right, with the data poisoning. But I would say broad brushstrokes from a GRC perspective, what should your non-technical business leaders, SMB business leaders, be thinking about as it relates to AI, and frankly, and I think we'll get there with what regulations they have to look out for. But I think if you could just give us a broad broad swath on GRC as it relates to AI.
Yeah, so I want to come back to something more fundamental as a foundation to that discussion around GRC. So when we look at a business, right, the majority of our clients are business owners, founders of businesses, and they've grown or they're growing, and as you grow, you bring in IT, and then what happens is often the business leaders are not speaking the same language as those who are in charge of IT or even cybersecurity. So probably the most fundamental starting point for business leaders before we even get to the GRC conversation is to establish a common language and a common understanding, and work with in a collaborative fashion between the leadership in the business. because when we talk about cyber risk management, it's really a horizontal across all elements of the business. And so there are areas in HR, in operations, in transportation aspects, in finance, accounting that all touch on cybersecurity, and they're all customers of and beneficiaries of the technical capabilities that have to be put in place. But really, where some of the biggest risks that we run into are really risks of misunderstanding, the human aspect of misunderstanding. So one of the ways to actually establish those common denominators of language is to establish policies and understand who owns cyber risk, right? And so one of the best ways to establish these policies is to also understand, well, what are your crown jewels? What is it that we value most in terms of data? And so it's understanding what those are and then establishing a set of policies, procedures around which you can start building up a common denominator of language and terms. And so one of the first things that you want to do is designate an individual within the business who is what we would consider an AI risk owner. And so that could be general counsel. It could be the CISO if you're big enough to have a chief information security officer. It could be your CIO. And so then what you want to do is establish an AI acceptable use policy. What are the terms and conditions of engaging with AI? That's what that policy is really about. Because one of the big risks also within businesses uh, is the use of shadow AI. It's employees coming into the business and who are using perhaps ChatGPT or Claude or some other tool, and they may not even realize that Copilot is available to them as part of the Microsoft environment. So there's going to be these, and we're seeing this with current clients right now, where you have multiple tool sets of AI. Might be approved, and some aren't. And so when you introduce shadow AI in that capacity, it creates risk to the business. So the first thing to do is establish that AI acceptable use policy, right? And make it known and to train your staff to understand that the use of unauthorized AI tools is prohibited unless they are vetted and approved by the company. And so that then extends into, I just want to say one more thing. It also extends into your vendor and third party risk management. More and more companies are relying on cloud service providers. And what's going on right now, and very few people are talking about it, is a lot of these vendors are updating their privacy policies. And WeTransfer just recently went through this where they quietly changed their policy to include language that allowed users of the WeTransfer tool to be able to use those artifacts to train WeTransfer's AI tool. And so that there was a little uproar around that, and then they backed off, but it's still a trend. And so as a business, you want to make sure you understand which vendors have access to your data. And if so, what are the controls or the restrictions around it about those organizations using your business's artifacts and data to train their agents. And so that's where you start losing your visibility into controlling your data, right? And we could go on and on from there, but it really starts with who owns it, and then establishing those initial policies and procedures and understanding where that risk may reside regarding your data with other organizations.
So I do want to piggyback off of what Max was saying there. I believe it's either ISACA or ISC2, one of the IT security certification bodies, more or less. And for all the technical that's in there, right? They put it in the order of people, process, technology, because you can throw all the tools at any problem, right? The latest and greatest, cutting edge. But if to Max's point, if that process isn't followed, if the people don't know the how to apply it or how to work within it, or what the the boundaries are for our organization, it's not going to be conducive to success. So the human element very much is in something to consider here. And like Max said, that acceptable use policy around what AI tools should we be using, are we allowed to use them at all, and what information do we put in there is imperative. I like to point to Samsung. I think it's maybe been about a year now, but Samsung ended up, I think, banning the use of AI outright because their engineering team put proprietary plans into ChatGPT. And guess what? Going back to the EULA question, right, of what did we accept to, they now own that. And so it does have the potential to be a huge detriment to your business if you put the wrong information in there. What we see on our side a lot is one of two things, right, with organizations coming to us asking about AI. It's either number one, hey, I want to use Copilot or ChatGPT. What do I do? Help me. Or it's, hey, we deployed Copilot or ChatGPT. Oh no, help me. And that comes down to a lot of data governance, right? They didn't realize what access they were giving their employees. They didn't have proper data classification on, what was sensitive, what was not, what belonged to this business unit versus that business unit, right? And all of a sudden, your front desk admin assistant has access to the CFO's financials just by a human prompt, right? A human query that they're asking Copilot. And again, the implications are huge there. So, when we put that in the context of shadow IT, right? Shadow IT is the idea of your staff using tools that your IT administrators are not aware of. So we may have a tool, maybe it's Teams, right? That is our communication platform, Teams calling, Teams chats, you name it. But maybe some folks don't like Teams, and so all of a sudden they spin up a new Slack tenant, or Zoom, or whatever it is, to host their meetings. We now don't have control or visibility into what goes on in those calls, in those chats. And it's the same with AI, right? What information are they putting in there? Who owns it? Where's it going at the end of the day? Who is on those conversations? And so shadow IT was always a concern. It was always an issue, right? It's why we do things like software application inventories. It's why we have tooling for insider threat protection to see, what's going to Google Drive or Box.com or Dropbox or any of those types of things. And now, right, in the age of AI, it's the exact same thing, except it's which agent are you using, right? What mailbox assistant did my staff member just give full delegated access to their account, that now not only can read their mail to help them be more efficient, but possibly send as them, right? Or, and who owns that mailbox data now? If that AI agent now sees everything in that's company data. So yeah, there's a lot of governance that has to go into securing not just the tools that we use, but securing the organization against the tools that we shouldn't be using.
Many companies that are probably watching, the leadership in the organizations, uh, many probably respond to requests for proposals from clients. Well, one of the dangers of AI, and as Enrique described, is that if you have somebody in your business, an employee, salesperson, they might go to an unapproved tool or an AI tool to input proposal, language and queries and prompts and things like that to help accelerate the development of a proposal. Well, I will tell you from firsthand experience, I've come across uh, competing organizations on open RFPs with competitive intelligence, because the uncontrolled or undisciplined use of shadow AI and competitors have allowed users to use certain tools to generate proposals. And so it's a great tool for that, but you want to control that data. You want to keep it inside your business. This is why, the things that Enrique just described, the controls, the policies, the procedures, the technical aspects, all of this comes into play. So it's both a technical and a GRC combined approach. I just wanted to reaffirm that.
I do, Max. As you know, your proximity to DC, I think, and based on your background, right? You are an expert in regulatory frameworks, right? So, is there a guidance or a federal or is a state by state regulatory framework about how businesses are leveraging AI or just AI in general?
So, in terms of compliance, right? The positive thing about compliance is that those compliance frameworks are usually publicly available, right? And so they're pretty clearly written, although that's always a questionable statement when it comes to government writing. But for the most part, they're pretty cut and dry in terms of the access to the information in those frameworks. Whether it's a framework like HIPAA under HHS, or maybe it's NERC-CIP, with the electricity subsector, and everything in between. You have these very accessible frameworks that you can ingest in AI agents to help distill information out of them in a manner that could support a compliance management effort or compliance program. And so, again, going back to the conversations about the business owners and putting policies and procedures into place, one framework in particular that actually makes a lot of sense is NIST came out with the risk management framework for AI. And they published that in January of last year, I believe, January 23. And the thing about AI is that when you look at managing compliance or help manage compliance, it's about right fitting the effort to the outcomes. And what you want to do, and with the risk AI RMF is what they call it, is that is a flexible framework that provides guidance to businesses that can be right fitted to the size of the organization. So can an organization like a Lockheed Martin or an IBM apply the risk or the AI RMF? Absolutely. Can a small business of 30 people that maybe is dealing with intellectual property and maybe manufacturing and has regulatory requirements, whether it's in the healthcare sector, the defense sector, or transportation or energy sectors, they can right fit that framework to provide guidance to their regulatory posture. And I use the term guidance deliberately because the AI risk management framework is not meant to be a compliance framework. It's meant to be a follow-on to something like the NIST cybersecurity framework, which is revision 2 now. And it creates a governance framework that can be right fitted to the business, that addresses all the things that go into, that go into managing cyber risks across the organization. And it treats AI as a risk within that process. So govern is central. Governing processes, procedures, capabilities is central to the AI RMF. And then what they're looking for is right fitting the mapping of capabilities, mitigation measures, and management key performance indicators into that governance framework. And so that can expand as your business expands. It can be tailored and flexible on an ongoing basis. And so everything pretty much we're talking about here in today's session can actually be managed under a strategic implementation of the NIST AI RMF.
So yes, NIST is the National Institute for Standards and Technologies, and that's driven out of the federal government, the U.S. federal government. as a body to lend guidance on a variety of topics. Like Max mentioned, right? There's the NIST cybersecurity framework, which is a pointed version of that. There's NIST 853. There's a bunch of them that cover cybersecurity controls, and it's intended to give guidance, right, on nearly all aspects of cybersecurity, as it relates to your business. So what we typically find with NIST publications is, or as I like to say, is that nobody likes to reinvent the wheel. So when you see guidelines come out from NIST as a governing body, like Max said, they're not a requirement, they're not a regulatory framework per se. It's more of a best practice guideline, but those regulatory bodies typically, follow suit or will iterate on the guidance from NIST. And even further down the road, and given the transitive property, then you start seeing insurance carriers, and you start to tweak their requirements based on what the governing bodies are saying. So if you're of the mindset of staying with your ear to the ground and trying to keep a pulse on AI as it develops, the NIST AI risk management framework is a great starting place. Will it evolve? Certainly, but it's probably the most uh, I'll say it has the widest breadth right now, and I think is the most applicable for, like Max said, businesses of all sizes. Is the beauty of it.
For employees, right, the human element, how would a small to mid-sized business address not just AI, but AI as it relates to cybersecurity for their employees? Like, how do they, right? We're talking about shadow AI and people just popping open ChatGPT and plugging in, company specific data that probably shouldn't be shared outside the organization. So how should a company, the CEO, CFO, COO think about, their employees and really bringing them up to a level where they are sharp enough to know to look out for certain things as it relates to artificial intelligence?
So firstly, I think, and this is anecdotal, my own perspective, right? I think some of that is addressed in what I would refer to as core controls, table stakes controls for the organization, right? Configuration management of your workstations, of your endpoints, application management for application whitelisting or blacklisting to an extent. And unfortunately for a lot of small business, they may be priced out of certain tooling, certain platforms. But I think for me, the introduction of AI, and this discussion certainly has some folks thinking, I got to get on it. I got to address AI right now. And I think to an extent that's true, but there's also a lot of core controls that are going to have, from a time to value perspective, immediate impact. They're going to bring a lot of additional governance that may not already be there right before the AI piece. So firstly, but as far as the rest of it, I think a good portion of it comes down to traditional security awareness training, right? And building a culture in your business of don't be afraid to raise the hand, don't be afraid to ask the question before you send it out. I've never been a big proponent of the name and shame, for phishing emails. It's not about, hey, you failed to do this thing. It's about continuous education and learning in the age of technological advancement that's unprecedented with the speed at which things are changing. And the more comfortable your staff are at asking those questions and bringing those things to you, right, the more opportunities you'll have to educate them and give them the opportunity to do the right thing. I do think in terms of, like Max said, the governance part, like the process, right? Having that acceptable use policy, having some documentation governing what is and is not acceptable in that organization, making sure that your staff, aren't just clicking through it to accept it, but give them time to read it. Right. Let them read it multiple times a year. Make it an annual event where we cover this every year. Right. And then train them on it, quiz them on it intermittently to see who's forgetting, who's just it's not sticking, and hold them accountable. There's certainly a period where accountability does come into play. But yeah, I think a lot of it does boil down to training, culture, and certainly the governance piece.
Yeah, I cannot emphasize more what Enrique just said. I'm a storyteller. I like stories, and it comes down to one of the biggest risks that I personally have encountered, probably more than anything across the last 15 years that I've been doing this, is the danger of groupthink. Is that when you're sitting around the table, nobody wants to look bad, especially in front of the boss. And many of you out there are business leaders and owners. And, there's a stigma around cyber or breach. It's sort of like, it's like there's this shame associated with it. And it comes back to what Enrique mentioned around culture. And it's a cultural transformation that has to happen. And the cyber threat environment, the landscape that's changing with AI, I mean, it is as bad as it was a couple of years ago and it is today. It is getting even worse. And CISOs, or the chief information security officers, anybody in charge of cyber in your organization, they're overwhelmed because the threat environment is so dynamic and it is so insidious and so persistent. And so there are challenges there with the individuals in terms of their own abilities to keep up with the threats, to keep up with the changing threats and the changing solutions. And so, there's a tendency to kind of let the IT person, the cybersecurity lead, to just say yes, whatever they want, just give them the resources. But there's got to be a conversation. We have to know what it is that we're managing risk against. And it involves data owners, for organizations that are maybe, you have different groups and different data sets, especially in the healthcare industry. It's about those different groups adhering and everybody has to be on the same team in terms of managing risk.
I would say, in closing, and my takeaways, I have three, but I want to put it out there to let you both take a stab at it, because obviously they're, what we covered. I would say, the biggest things that I was getting out of this discussion are three things, right? Max, you put it so eloquently: the crown jewels, right? Process, and then core controls are probably the big three that I pulled out of this. Crown jewels being, hey, what is the data, right? The most important data in our org, and who owns it and who's responsible for protecting it. The process, whether it be, hey, what state are we in? Are there industry specific frameworks that we need to adhere to, right? And then the other one being, we could baseline to NIST, right? And crosswalk, like you said, Max. And then the last one being core controls. Do we have good infrastructure, right? Is our tech stack mature to a point? Now, granted, not everyone can achieve, a enterprise level of security program or infrastructure, but you can get really close. You can get really close, even if you're a small to mid-sized business. You just have to do a little bit of homework. I want to put that out there to get you both to say, yes, those make sense and those track to what you think the audience should be getting out of this discussion, or maybe, I'm completely in the wrong direction. But I want to open it up to you both before we close and open it up to questions from the audience to jump in there.
I think those are all good points. Yeah, and definitely takeaways. I wouldn't contradict any of that. I know we want to keep it to three, but I think two things I would add, right? So like you said, identify your core controls and the crown jewels, right? And it's a simple question: what would put you out of business, right? Which, if that system goes down, if that data leaks, what would put you out of business? And that question does tie back to what Max was saying about allowing leadership to be challenged in certain, in a constructive way. And I always say, there's the technical people who are ingrained, they're subject matter experts, they know what they do, they know your business, right? That's your IT folks, that's your security folks. But it can be a different language coming from the business side of it, the executive side, and the leadership side of it. And the way that you bridge that gap is how you evaluate risk, right? Come up with that common language of, okay, we're asking what'll put us out of business. What what is a classification or a severity, right? That both your CEO, your CFO, and the IT folk will agree on and understand, right? What is that impact? And then once you're aligned on that, it makes those conversations a lot easier. So certainly identify the crown jewels and be able to constructively have conversations around impact and assess that in a manner that's consistent from top to bottom of the organization. Um, and the other piece I would say, and I think you did touch on it, would just be that there are resources available. Granted, written by the federal government or other regulatory bodies, and a little dry, but there's resources available to help you get your hands around some of this. And we don't have to boil the ocean. Whether it's a best practice framework, NIST 853 or NIST CSF, there is nothing that says you have to do everything that those frameworks have in them. It's about putting it over the lens of your business and what is a best effort attempt in the context of your business to get closer to achieving those goals. Right? It's a balance of interruption to operations, productivity impact, business impact, right? And at the end of the day, it's going to be different from one business to another, from whether that's small, mid-size, enterprise. No two organizations are going to do anything quite the same way, and that's okay. As long as it's that best effort, it's what works for you, and it is following the guidance to make those informed decisions. So
Yeah, that everything Enrique just said is spot on. And if we were a train here, I'm gonna add on the last car. And so the last car to that, thinking through that question that Ben gave Enrique and I, when you walk through those risk determinations, you're ultimately going to wind up with a decision to make about resource allocation. And what are resources? Your people, your processes, your tools, and your money. And so managing cyber risk can sometimes seem overwhelming. It's almost like you're trying to hold back the ocean. And the point of this conversation is to instill in everyone here the understanding that cyber risk, yes, it can appear to be overwhelming, and perhaps there are those out there, almost acting like the sky's falling, and yeah, it's getting bad, but there's ways to manage it. And that balance, once you understand your risks, as Enrique talked about, then you can reach a point where you can make investment decisions regarding your operational expenses and how those work and render in terms of your people. Do you have enough people, right? Do you have the right people? Do they need to be trained? How often do they need to be trained? What kind of training, right? Processes, the policies, procedures, plans in place, the government's framework, the tooling, making sure you have all the right technical capabilities in place to defend and protect your environment, and then money. Because, one of the things I hear when I work with clients is the IT person or the CISO will tell me, we get whatever we ask for. And immediately my antennas go up. And what that says to me is a conversation is not happening. It's a one directional conversation and a reaction. And you can't manage cyber risk effectively with that kind of posture. You have to engage your management team, your stakeholders, because if you make an investment in one area, perhaps on the IT side, or you look at implementing a policy and you don't engage with your key stakeholders to see how it might impact their day-to-day operations and their abilities to function and meet the objectives of the business, well, then all of a sudden you're creating other problems. So that's why that dialogue, that breaking down the barriers to groupthink is so important, and that open dialogue about changing the culture. So for me, it's always about business transformation. Cybersecurity is ultimately, a business transformation discussion Enrique and his team have a more difficult challenge with all the changing capabilities on the solution side, but on the people side, that's where I focus. And so breaking down those barriers, having that 360 conversation, you'll be able to reach a point where you can start managing cyber risk in a sustainable fashion and not feel like it's hopeless.
Well, thank you both. Thank you for the discussion. That was awesome. I definitely learned a lot, and I hope the audience did as well too. And so thank you. Very much appreciated.
Yeah, great conversation.
Yeah. Thank you, guys. Appreciate it.